This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with William Voegeli his latest book, The Pity Party, a mean-spirited diatribe against liberal compassion. William Voegeli is the author of Never Enough, America's Limitless Welfare State, and he is a visiting scholar at the Henry Salvatori Center at Claremont McKenna College and the senior editor of the Claremont Review of Books. William, glad to have you here.
Good to be with you, Richard.
So, The Pity Party, the title of your book, I kind of want to ask you a question about that. If we're invited to the pity party, and I take it from your book that pretty much everyone's invited. And so we go, it's thrown by liberal opinion elites. What will we be doing at the party, and what will constitute having a good time?
Well, I think you and I at the party would be the kind of folks who are standing off against the wall in the corner, making sardonic remarks about all revelers in the center of the room. Telling each other and the few other cynics who gather around us about their pretensions, their moral vanity, and we would probably not be invited back to the next iteration of this gathering, is my suspicion.
Is your suspicion? So where does this come from? I mean, we're talking about the politics of compassion. It's something we see. I mean, we're so close to it. We're so enveloped by it that it's almost become something we don't even think that much about anymore. It takes something kind of egregious for us to roll our eyes. We went through the presidency of Bill Clinton hearing this stuff, perhaps most prominently. Also, Barack Obama uses it. It's almost the warp and woof of his rhetorical appeal. And in a way, he's saying, Barack Obama in particular, kind of the standard of American patriotism now is your compassion for your fellow American citizens, and that's why we need to have things like Obamacare and so on and so on. But where do you think this comes from? Isn't this really just what liberalism does? You note in the book that it seems to really come, so progressivism of FDR's period, maybe not so much of Truman or Kennedy, but that with Kennedy's assassination, something new happens. Something new happens in liberalism with vis-a-vis their thoughts about their fellow American citizens and the types of ways they want to appeal to achieve change.
Yes, I think I can pull a couple of strands out of it. It's a complicated story. I think here's one aspect that I think, in a certain sense, has nothing to do with politics or political ideas, but is kind of more basic. Which I devoted just a paragraph or two to this in the Pity Party, but it at least as important as that, and probably needs more. We live in a time, we modern Americans, citizens of the first world, live in a time of, by the standards of the rest of the human race throughout history, extraordinary prosperity, comfort, security. When you think of, humans for thousands of years getting along without anesthesia, with very little that could be done for somebody who was sick or injured, for the constant fear of starvation. When you think of the fact that Deirdre McCloskey has sort of cataloged this, that since the Industrial Revolution, per capita GDP in the countries that have sort of embraced markets and innovation and growth has increased by an average rate of 1.5% per year for 200 years. The compound interest means that we are, I forget the number, 15, 18 times better off than people were in 1814. I mean, that's astonishing, you know. And so I think what that does is that for us moderns, suffering seems like an anomaly, a departure from the norm for almost everyone else in human history, and a lot of people still in the world today. Suffering is pretty much what it means to be a human being, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of take it for granted, and life is about, even in the 18th century, Samuel Johnson said of this business of being human that there's more to endure than enjoy. Well, we don't buy that anymore. We think that the whole point is to there's more to enjoy, and so there is, I think, more than any syllogism, more than any argument, there is this kind of sensibility that's distinctively modern, which says that suffering is wrong. Suffering is not our lot. Suffering means something is out of kilter, and we should be committing ourselves to rectifying it. So I think that a significant part of what the book is about, what a discussion of modern politics as it relates to compassion is about, is simply that there is this baseline assumption that we don't have to put up with these things. And if people that we observe are suffering, then that's an affront and a wrong that has to be corrected. So, and that's not the sort of the province of any political party or ideology. I think being alive in the modern age means just sort of taking that for granted,
Now, I don't disagree
Yeah.
at all with what you're saying, and I remember you talking about this in the book, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, we, in a way, such an individualistic and comfortable age is really affronted by the very idea of death. And we tend to think, death might be the end of being itself, because it's just something, it seems as a remote event to us. We aren't really accustomed to seeing it that much. We have, a few relatives die here and there, but it's not a part of our lives. And so maybe this is also driving the, live forever movement, or that we're starting to see emerge. I want to specifically focus on, because it isn't just this though. I think that's
and
that's what, and I guess when I asked you the question about the Kennedy assassination, it seemed to me in the book you argue that the one takeaway from that, or one lesson, bitter experience lesson that liberals gained, we could say, was that America itself didn't understand the need to be compassionate. And so, because Kennedy, even though Kennedy is killed by a communist for his own reasons, the lesson was this was somehow the fault of right-wing racist America that resented a civil rights warrior. We'll leave aside that Kennedy wasn't really a civil rights warrior at all.
Every element of which is completely
false.
fraudulent. But
Yes.
you're right.
And so, and then we can, we go forward from there, and it seems that is also working in your book, and then also something that you sort of touch on in your book, but I think is also a preeminent factor, is just the anti-foundationalism, or kind of the moral relativism, philosophic relativism that is just sort of baked into the way we think now. And so and that leaves us with kind of one standard. And I think you make this particular point pretty well early on in the book. What that would leave us with is the need to vindicate myself through expressive action. And you say, I'll just quote you here, I like this few sentences here in the introduction. The term compassion or empathy, or even kindness, is routinely used not just to name a moral virtue, but to designate the pinnacle or even the entirety of moral excellence. And you say, compassion is the moral sea we swim in, which works against our awareness of it, much less efforts to chart its depths and currents. I mean, this just is what we do. We watch Oprah, or we did watch Oprah, and we felt we were touched. We felt good about various outpourings of sympathy or compassion, but that's kind of where it leaves, and we don't really think much deeper than that. It vindicates itself.
Yeah, this is one of those books. I think Never Enough too, that you mentioned, that I wrote 4 years ago. It has this same quality of sort of taking up a subject that's hiding in plain sight. It's out there, sitting there all the time. We forget about it, and then somebody needs to step back and say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is there, and it's important. It matters." I think here's one way of I think getting at what you're talking about. There is within the liberal project this sort of back and forth tension between, on the one hand, kind of technocratic management, a belief in expertise, the right and duty of smart, trained people to run things for the benefit of all of us, and on the other, a more immediately accessible sort of fervor, a kind of righteousness and moral indignation. The ism of progressivism that sort of laid the foundations for New Deal liberalism 100 years ago. So we're talking now about Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and the people who sort of brought social science to America in the late 19th and early 20th century. The ism of progressivism was the idea that experts understood things, that they understood the laws of history and could guide us to a better future and accelerate our progress towards it in a way that we would not do if just sort of left to our own devices, That particular disposition, I think, became far more tenuous, particularly after World War II. You had two horrific world wars in the space of 3 decades. You had the rise of brutal totalitarian regimes that did astonishingly depraved and cruel things on a mass scale. And the belief that the sort of pre-1914 belief that if we just entrusted the solution of problems to trained experts, that we would progress consistently and confidently towards this ever brighter future. That seemed obscene in a way in the wake of all this, that kind of bland confidence, So I think the liberal response in the aftermath of that was to take up again. The initial response was to reject all that, to say with great vigor that what we really need is a kind of a new humility about these things. So ever since then, liberals have been very fond of the tagline from a speech that a famous jurist with a great name, Judge Learned Hand, gave in 1944, where he said, "The spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it's right." So this is a kind of, as you say, a kind of now codified moral relativism. The liberal interpretation of what went wrong in the first half of the 20th century becomes that people were too sure of themselves, and instead we need to be to approach these things with an attitude of, well, who's to say what's right or wrong? We're not going to do that. This sort of lays the groundwork for a reduced emphasis on technocratic expertise and an increased emphasis on a kind of politics of compassion that everybody can understand. Everybody recoils from the sight of a beggar seeking food, or a sick child on a late night money-raising commercial or something. This is not something that you have to go to Harvard to figure out, So this makes this puts liberals in a way, the liberal enterprise back on the side of the people and sort of eases the problem of that kind of elitism. And so I think there is within liberalism this constant tension, this back and forth. Do we rely on the smart people, or do we rely on feelings that anybody can share?
Yeah, no, and I think that actually nicely opens up into a discussion you have in the book about, and I appreciated this, the way compassion, the way it's expressed as authorizing or being the ground of a lot of government action, is itself an attempt to reforge teleological unity in the world. If modernity is about fracturing, and we, there's all these sorts of different spheres and modes of knowing and doing things, but none of them actually speak to each other, and there's no actual moral center anymore, and there's no religious center, of course, at all. Then maybe we can reforge that by, in some way making us all feel each other's pain, as a certain president said.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think sounds like we're in heated agreement here,
yeah.
You and I. What I think liberals, like in a sense, like all people who live in modern, prosperous, democratic societies, embrace the modern bargain, different strokes for different folks. The idea that everybody should have rights that extend up to the maximum point at which they don't curtail anyone else's rights. And how you believe, whether you believe in one God or three or none, or worship him this way or that way, that's a private matter. Whatever you want to do whatever you want to believe. Just don't try to impose it on anybody else. That's the core of the modern bargain, right? Mm-hmm. I think the problem, in conservatives in their way try to cheat on this a little bit too, but I think liberals sort of more explicitly and out there want the modern bargain, but then also they want the pre-modern bargain, the satisfaction that comes from living in a society that is dedicated to a higher purpose and that is united in a certain cause and a certain outlook. And so that there is, this I think was shown most sort of least, how to put it, least subtly, in the least unguarded fashion by the now notorious speech on the politics of meaning that Hillary Clinton gave when she was First Lady. So this would go back now, I think it was either 1993 or 1994, where she said, this is the paraphrase, but a pretty close paraphrase, what's missing in our lives is a purpose that unites us and drives us on to better things and brings us together as a nation to care about one another and to have a common goal and framework. Yes, but I mean, what that's supposed to be in a secular modern society is never made clear, and probably never can be made clear. But yet there is this feeling that we should have it both ways. We should be free to do whatever we want, but we should be united by this fellowship beneath the skin. And compassion, I think, is the closest thing we have that, particularly from the perspective of a modern American liberal, solves that problem.
Yeah, no, and I think if we think about America's leading pragmatist, Richard Rorty, I mean, I think this is something that's moving in all of his books as well, is eliminate cruelty, constantly move to eliminate cruelty. And so how does one do that? Well, you preemptively censor, attack, criticize those you think are making politically incorrect arguments, racist arguments, homophobic arguments, even if that means you really don't get a vigorous dialogue and debate. I suppose that's kind of the point, is to prevent anyone from perceiving that they're outside the center or outside the public square. And so you actually, what you don't get is actually robust debate about meaning in a way. I want to ask you. So, if two questions, Go ahead.
But just a quick thought on that. Yes, I think that's right. I mean, Rorty is not explicitly identified with the philosophical movement that is sometimes called communitarianism. That's more, I think, probably the most prominent exponent of that is Michael Sandel, right? Yes, that's right. But nevertheless, I think I think that thought, that idea, is an important component of the liberal outlook in our time. But I think you were you were exactly right about this this point and this difficulty with it, which is that liberals in our time long for a community that somehow, I would say impossibly, has an inside but doesn't have an outside. It's everybody who wants to can belong to this community, but nevertheless, so it won't be exclusive. It won't make anybody feel left out. But I think the problem is that it's the insideness of community necessarily depends on there being outsideness too. A community to which everybody can belong is a community to which belonging doesn't really mean that much. It doesn't satisfy any longing, and so in every effort to sort of make that belonging more significant and consequential, and to give it some definition and solidity, then necessarily makes it or runs the risk of making it kind of exclusive. But if it's exclusive, then they feel that it's invidious and hurts people's feelings, and they're opposed to it.
Although I would say it's quite exclusive. They paradoxically want everyone to be involved in it in some way. They want to pull you into it, but they don't recognize there's a huge blind spot of seeing just how coercive they're being, particularly with the way and you see this in the use of language and the manipulation of language as well in this regard. I want to get to 2 points though. So what's wrong with conservatives and a lot of libertarians here? Why don't they just kind of get with the program and understand we have tremendous wealth, we are kind and generous people, we do have the ability to solve problems. That's one of the things America is really good at, solving complex problems. So shouldn't conservatives tend to be the ones who remain skeptical, who still tend to think that we're living in a condition of scarcity, which is the reason why you want to have the rule of law and limited government and property rights and all of these things. The reasons why you can't just, because someone is hurting, the government can't just move and attempt to solve their problem. In one respect, it's kind of like if the problem is it's just we can't really cope with anyone suffering because we're so wealthy, then maybe conservatives are the problem. That's maybe a simple question. My more, I guess, a different question isn't compassion just what democratic societies do? In other words, I think Tocqueville would say in a democratic society, we feel more deeply the sufferings of our neighbors because of a condition of equality. We feel that more deeply. We see ourselves in their situation more easily, and so we're more motivated to act and to relieve that suffering. And that will probably take the form. I mean, Tocqueville wants it to remain civic associations for the most part in local government, but it will probably take the form over time of central government action. So, isn't this just where democratic societies end up?
It is the gravitational pull, perhaps, that is inherent in the nature of democracy. I think you're right about that, and I think you and I read democracy in America the same way, which is that what democracy does. It's not that fellow feeling that being able to imagine what someone else is going through is a new development. It's as old as the human race. But democracy gives us, in a way that pre-democratic society did not, the sense that we can and should empathize with and comprehend everybody's suffering, because it insists, in a way that pre-democratic societies did not, that everybody is basically alike. Hierarchy was the sort of fundamental political reality until 200-300 years ago. Now the baseline assumption is that of equality, of similarity, and so the millionaire and the beggar are held to be much alike in ways that are much more important in the ways that they're different, right? I think, as regards your first question, well, I think the conservative, and this goes back to democracy in America again. I think the conservative position is inherently difficult. Anybody who signs up to be called a conservative is sort of admitting that time is not on your side, right? The term itself sort of implies that you have enlisted to defend, to conserve something that is that is valuable, and therefore it is worth struggling to conserve, and also that it's vulnerable, and therefore it needs to be conserved. It in a certain sense, it can't take care of itself. And I think, what I think American conservatives are signed up for is the experiment in self-government, which is inherently vulnerable for reasons that Tocqueville laid out very well, that were previously, I think, in ways that are fundamentally similar, described as inherently tenuous by Madison and later by Lincoln, that democracy tends to produce attitudes and habits that, left to themselves, become destructive of the democratic enterprise. That we become impatient with Republican restraints. We become confident about our ability to simply do what feels right to us, and we want to brush aside those kinds of restraints that get in our way. Compassion plays a big role in this, because compassion inclines us to feel very confident about sort of the rightness of our cause. We're on the side of the suffering. We want to push back against those who are cruel and callous, and armed with that belief, we tend to rush into things and simply do what we think needs to be done, and worry about the niceties of the law and the politics and elections, that kind of stuff later on.
I was going to say, something that I had in my mind as I'm reading your book is I was thinking, of course, a brief anecdote. I recently interviewed Roger Scruton on the program about his book, How to Be a Conservative, and he kind of boiled it down to a statement from Lord Palmerston: to delay is to live. That was his definition of conservative. That was, which I thought was a very British conservatism, I suppose. But I thought that was great. But compassionate conservatism, to the extent I thought there was anything worth considering there, it was the attempt to have compassion still be subservient to larger ends, say virtue, or just ideas of human flourishing that it had to be tied to. And so when Bush said, I think of a direct quote I remember from that period, my faith-based initiatives will unleash the armies of compassion across the country. And I think he thought it would help people who were leading dysfunctional lives, those who were marginally employed through a lot of bad choices they make or made. All of these sorts of things would, in effect, receive some sort of remediation, not directly through the government, but through these initiatives. And that seemed pretty good, although it seemed the way it ended in practice, and maybe it's rhetoric to find it, is it ended up not having any real limits, it seemed. Food stamps applications and go up dramatically during the Bush presidency, even though we're in a period of economic growth, things like that. And so compassionate conservatism seemed to fail, I think, for largely the same reasons that we're talking about here.
Yes. I think that,
I'm obviously painting with a broad brush there,
well,
but it seemed to struggle to find real limiting principles.
yeah, it's interesting. When Bush wrote what amounted to his memoir, I think the book was called Decision Points. Is that
Yes.
that sound right? Yeah. As I understand it, I haven't double-checked this, but the words compassionate conservatism appear nowhere in that book. So this, that presidency really became about 9/11 and terrorism, and so you could sort of go back and construct this interesting counterfactual history of the Bush presidency without 9/11. Would compassionate conservatism have worked out differently, worked out better, amounted to more? I think that there were some interesting ideas there, and some important ones too, I think. And I think it was. I think the best thing to be said for it is along the lines of what you just said, which is that the idea behind compassionate conservatism was a critique of a contradiction in the liberal enterprise. And that contradiction is this. A true committed modern liberal is someone who says, we're so compassionate that we care tremendously about how you are, but we're also so non-judgmental that we couldn't care less about what you do. That's your business.
Yeah.
But of course, anybody who's out in the world knows that what you do has a big effect on how you are.
Yeah.
And so that being non-judgmental and saying, well, if you want to sleep till noon, if you have vodka for breakfast every morning, and that's your business. We don't care. We just want to make sure that you sort of get along all right, that nothing bad happens to you. So I think the idea behind compassionate conservatism was that the habits and dispositions that have helped millions of people all over the world lead productive lives worth living were ones that were in fact non-optional. They weren't just lifestyle options. They were in fact the way to approach things. And government that genuinely, and a political enterprise that genuinely cared about people, had to promote those rather than say that they were, who's to say whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
So I thought as far as that went, it was good. I think the big difficulty, even if it had been pursued under more favorable circumstances without worrying about another 9/11 terror attack, I think the big difficulty was that George Bush developed this idea of compassionate conservatism as a candidate for president. He talked about it a lot in 1998 and 1999. It's a very, in a certain sense, he joined his wife's church. He became a Methodist as an adult, and it's a very sort of Wesleyan notion. This idea of going about and being talking people out of bad ways and into better ones. But that's I don't think very many of us, left, right, or center, are entirely comfortable with the President of the United States play that role. It's when he gave his best speeches on the subject, it seemed like he was running to be Billy Graham, not president.
Yeah. No, and if you think about the one big achievement before 9/11 was No Child Left Behind, which is that No Child Left Behind comes from the Children's Defense Fund, if I'm not mistaken.
Right element, yeah.
And in a way, that to me exemplified the problem. That is almost a warlike statement, No Child Left Behind. Such an absolutist statement, and the power you're giving the federal government there, which of course I would argue has paved the way for the Common Core, where you're going to have actually curriculum controlled by the federal government, I think, over time. On another point, though, it's just thinking about how conservatives have responded in this period of the politics of compassion. So we talk about compassionate conservatism, and then we've got other responses which seem rhetorically outmatched in this period, and yet when I think about, you think who's the most successful politician in this politics of compassion? It's Bill Clinton, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, I think I was in junior high and high school at the time, and when I look back, I think it seemed to me everyone was sort of for a few days. I won't say moved, but
You were junior high and high school in the 1990s, you're saying?
yes, and
You're a young fellow, okay.
but I remember my parents and others. Everyone was kind of caught up in what he was saying and these compassion moments. Yet I think we look back and kind of laugh at him now, and we really remember him for sort of hard-edged things that maybe he deserves some credit for: economic growth, free trade, welfare reform, and it's those compassion moments. I mean, you mentioned Hillary Clinton, the politics of meaning, but she's kind of pilloried for that now. And I guess I'm just sort of thinking, well, how powerful is this? And we've kind of been discussing one problem with it, which is the act itself. At getting the policies passed itself. Boy, haven't we just seen that with Obamacare? That's what matters. I'm doing something to effect compassion, but yet results, implementation, all of these sorts of things come much later and receive less emphasis. That seems to be one weak spot. And yet, but also we look back and I think we kind of know that Bill Clinton was bullshitting us. To paraphrase an idea in one of your later chapters, we kind of see that now, and so maybe it's not as powerful as we think. I don't know.
Well, I think that Clinton is a very interesting, very important figure. The Republican nominees won 5 of 6 presidential elections before 1992. They've since Clinton in 92. I mean, starting with that one, they've exceeded the 50% popular total in the popular vote just once. George W. Bush with 51% in 2004. So Clinton, I really think, either shifted or sensed and took advantage of a shift in the political dynamic. And certainly, I think the reason that Republicans did so well in the 60s and 70s and 80s was that that liberalism had come across to too many people as untrustworthy. Liberals couldn't be counted on to make government do basic things: keep the streets safe, keep the currency sound, protect America's interests in the world. I think it's not coincidental that after the Berlin Wall comes down and the Cold War ends, and there is this sense that the world is not such a dangerous place, that people move to this new feeling that, well, perhaps we can sort of indulge our desire to have the softness of liberalism rather than the stern discipline that we associate with conservatives. And so I think that the Clinton sensed that and took advantage of it. I think furthermore that yes, it sort of became a parody of itself, this "I feel your pain" stuff. And in a way, I think the succeeding Democratic presidents, I mean, the pity party introduction opens with poor Al Gore trying to emulate that.
I remember that.
To come across as being as empathetic as Bill Clinton, but there was no way to see. He was a less talented politician in those respects, and to present himself in that way succeeded only in making him sound like a phony and a fraud. Clinton was sort of like what Truman Capote said of Holly Golightly. I think Bill Clinton was a real phony. The stuff he was peddling was crap, but it was crap he really believed in. But I think when Al Gore tried the same thing, he just sounded like an insincere guy striking a pose, and it to his detriment, But so I think it's in a way it was an inevitable, that there would be this sort of walk back in a way, and that we would wind up with the next Democratic president being not florid Al Gore, but this very cool customer, Barack Obama, who burst on the scene in 2007 and 2008 and seemed the people in his audiences were standing and weeping and so forth, but Obama himself always seemed completely composed and sort of distant from it all.
Yes.
In a way that emotionally, in a sort of in thespian terms, I guess, that was kind of the only way to go after Bill Clinton.
Yeah. Well, interesting though. I mean, I tend to see a lot of Obama's statements as kind of, really principled politics of compassion type moments, but I didn't see in your book. How do you sort of fit these speeches though in 2008? They sort of we're the change we've been waiting for. The oceans we're going to heal the oceans. The Berlin speech, the famous Berlin speech. All of these sorts of things. They don't strike me as compassion. It strikes me so much as right, because there's no answer to hope. There's no answer to hope for what, or what are we actually going to do? It's just we're telling ourselves these good things, and I'm going to achieve them. And hasn't this guy in the office currently done some things that are ineffective and not very hasn't secured the national interest, and I can. But it's almost was just like some sort of postmodern gobbledygook moment on the national stage about narrative and not even remotely tied to facts.
Yes, well, here's one way of getting at it, I think, contrasting Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Both of them, in their ways, talked about moving past the argument between liberals and conservatives. For Clinton, it was triangulation. Which involves sort of ordering from a menu in a Chinese restaurant. You pick certain items from column A and certain other ones from column B. He understood himself in the sort of the aftermath of Reagan to be dealing with a public that liberalism was kind of still on probation, and so he had to move carefully and do things that most of his party voted against and most of the opposition party voted for, like NAFTA and the welfare reform bill. The thing that was always, about Clinton, this was always very hard to figure out, was whether triangulation, I mean, in some ways it seemed with him, it seemed closer to less of a political philosophy than a personality disorder, Yeah. This was a guy who often said that he was opposed to what was the phrase, false dichotomies. But he sort of came across as a guy who didn't necessarily believe there was such a thing as a true dichotomy, So you could could smoke marijuana and not smoke marijuana. You could make yourself available to the draft and not make yourself available to the draft. You could be faithful to your wife and not faithful to your wife. There always seemed to be a gray area between everything else that people would see as black and white. Obama, instead of talking about blending the left and right alternatives, seemed in this, you're right, very airy and hard to pin down way to talk about transcending them all together. There would be, I think, the political writer at the Brookings Institute, Bill Galston, has said that this. This transcendence, this business about not a red America or a blue America, turned out to be entirely tonal. All of the, unlike Clinton, all of the policy particulars were going to be on Democratic terms. Democrats no longer felt by the time Obama was elected, and they had big majorities in 2008 in Congress, that they were on probation. They thought it was happy days are here again, the New Deal. You know, you remember that famous cover of Time magazine when Obama was about to be inaugurated in 2009 that photoshopped him as FDR.
Well, Sam Tannenhouse's essay in the New Republic, you know, the death of conservatism.
That's right.
And the book, which is kind of laughable,
So, you know, I think all Obama really believed that was necessary were these sort of inclusive rhetorical gestures that would signal to people that that Washington politics wasn't going to be as intense, there wouldn't be the squabbling, but nevertheless, all of the policy questions were going to be decided on purely liberal democratic terms, and the concession to the Republican would be that to listen to them politely, to not say mean things about them, and that they would have the sense that they had been given a hearing before none of their objections made their way into any laws, you know. And when Republicans decided, no, that's not exactly what we understand compromise to mean, then things, you know, turned vengeful, and also for Democrats have turned very bad in many measures, by many measures now in the aftermath of the 2014 midterms. The Democrats, up and down, even at the state legislative level, are in worse shape now than they've been at any time since the 1920s.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's interesting, right? We transcend partisanship, and yet, if anything, particularly in the states, what we've seen happen is the red states have become redder, blue states have become bluer. The kind of, maybe we can, a closing kind of thought here, question, observation, is on the future of compassionate politics, because it seems to me it has a problem, and that problem is largely the one you spelled out and never enough. And that it isn't the sophistication of counter policy arguments by conservatives and libertarians, but it's really two things, and that's budgets and demographics. And that if compassionate politics stands for one thing, it's enacting large programs to heal, you know, real and perceived problems in society, and we're running out of the ability to do that rapidly. And and the things that we have, the policies that we have, we really can't even fund for much longer. And so it seems to me that's the hard reality that's coming. But I don't know what your thoughts on that for kind of the future of these rhetorical appeals. I suppose if it's locked into kind of an overall societal, cultural way we think about ourselves, that it continues for a while, but nevertheless.
Yes, I think that as America, as developed societies around the world confront this problem of paying for the promises made decades ago in a new era when there are the demographic reality of more old people and fewer young people makes them more and more difficult to pay for. I think this is going to be an extremely stern test of the entire left-of-center enterprise of greater reliance on the state to provide social welfare benefits. And the fundamental now that Republicans under Reagan understood the power of promising people limited taxes or reduced taxes, then you set up this push comes to shove situation. The conservative hope is that when it becomes apparent that we have a tax system on the one hand and a set of benefits promises on the other that simply cannot be
reconciled
or continued simultaneously. That the way that will be resolved is that people will treat the tax system as the independent variable and the benefit system as the dependent variable, and will accept, perhaps not enthusiastically, but nonetheless accept adjustments to the benefits that make them align with the tax system. They'll go for means testing. They'll increase the retirement age. They'll change the inflation formula. These kinds of things. The liberal hope is the mirror image of that. They hope that people are so devoted to receiving the benefits that they've grown accustomed to, that they've heard about for years, that their parents and grandparents did, that when push comes to shove, however reluctantly, people would say, we've got to increase taxes to keep these benefits basically intact. We have to, here in America, we have to have a value-added tax like they do throughout most of Western Europe. We're going to have taxes. I think sometimes off the record, but every responsible person on the left will say that you cannot do what liberals have promised to do simply by raising taxes on millionaires and hedge fund guys. You have to have a tax system that hits nearly everybody in a way that's really significant. And only if you do that are you going to make this work. Well, so I think this, in a way, is kind of the fiscal drama that is on the horizon. The idea that we can have it both ways, that we can have a Republican tax system and a Democratic welfare state, is not sustainable for too many more years.
Yes. Yeah. No. I think that's right, and you've talked about that some and Never Enough as well. That rhetorical appeal has never been aligned with a fiscal system that actually works in that regard. So I suppose one way around this also is the attempt, the realization of this, and that's why you have increasingly the move to make everyone a victim, except for maybe a reviled minority. Or something like that. I mean, that seems to be part of, you talk about that in the book, which I thought was an interesting observation, Occupy Wall Street, among others. There's,
that's right.
In a way, we're all disadvantaged here. Yeah.
Yes, the 99% means that people making $250,000, $300,000 a year, they're victims too.
So, yeah. But Bill, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with William Voegeli about his latest book, The Pity Party. Thank you so much.
Sure, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.